The Montana sun was sinking low over the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range, painting the valley in hues of amber and gold. Jackson Blackwood sat on the weathered porch of his modest ranch house, his calloused fingers working methodically to clean his trusty Colt revolver. At 53, his face was a map of the hard years he'd endured. Deep lines etched around steel-blue eyes that had seen too much death. A graying beard that did little to hide the scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. A permanent reminder of a knife fight in Dodge City some 15 years ago. The quiet of the evening was disturbed only by the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance and the soft creak of his rocking chair against the rough-hewn boards beneath him. I'd like to kindly ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. I'm curious, what city are you watching from today? 3 years had passed since Jackson had hung up his marshal's badge in Colorado and purchased this small spread just outside of Promise Creek, Montana territory. The town itself was little more than a dusty main street with a general store, a bank, the Silver Spoon Saloon, and a handful of other establishments trying to bring civilization to this remote corner of the frontier. After 20 years of tracking outlaws across 5 territories, Jackson had come here seeking something that had eluded him his entire life: peace. The war had taken his youth, the badge had taken his family, and the years had taken his optimism. All that remained was a tired man with a reputation that followed him like a shadow, even to this quiet valley. Mr. Blackwood. The high-pitched voice of young Tommy Reynolds, the 12-year-old son of the general store owner, carried across the property as the boy raced up the dirt path leading to the ranch house. Jackson set down his revolver and straightened in his chair. The boy's face was flushed, his breathing heavy from the exertion of running the mile from town. "Slow down, boy. What's got you running like the devil himself is on your heels?" Jackson's voice was deep and gravelly, worn rough by years of trail dust and whiskey. Tommy doubled over, hands on knees, gasping for breath. It's Doc Sullivan, sir. Says you need to come quick. There's a woman. She's hurt real bad. Doc says you're the only one who might know what to do." Jackson's brow furrowed. "What does Sullivan think I know about doctoring? I've patched up bullet wounds in my time, but I'm no physician." "No, sir." Tommy shook his head vigorously. "Doc says she's been whipped something awful. Says it reminds him of what he saw during the war. Says you'd understand." The mention of whipping sent a cold shiver down Jackson's spine. Memories of prisoner camps and the brutality men could inflict upon one another, flashing unbidden across his mind. He hadn't served as a surgeon during the war, but he'd seen enough men die from infection after being flogged to know what Sullivan was asking of him. "Tell Sullivan I'll be there directly," Jackson said, rising to his feet with a slight wince as his old wounds protested the sudden movement. "And Tommy, not a word of this to anyone else in town. You understand?" The boy nodded solemnly before turning and racing back down the path. Jackson watched him go, then moved with purpose into the house. From beneath his bed, he pulled out an old wooden chest, the brass fittings tarnished with age. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small leather case containing various powders, tinctures, and salves, remedies learned from an old Cheyenne medicine man who'd saved Jackson's life after a Sioux arrow had found its mark in his shoulder. The methods were unconventional, certainly not something the Army doctors would approve of, but Jackson had seen them work when conventional medicine had failed. 20 minutes later, Jackson guided his chestnut mare down Promise Creek's main street. The setting sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and most of the town's respectable citizens had retired to their homes for the evening. Only the Silver Spoon showed signs of life, piano music and raucous laughter spilling out onto the street. Jackson tied his horse outside Doc Sullivan's small clinic, a humble clapboard building with a sign that had faded almost to illegibility. The bell above the door jangled as Jackson stepped inside, the familiar smells of carbolic acid, alcohol, and suffering greeting him. Dr. Patrick Sullivan, a man in his 60s with white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, emerged from the back room, his shirt sleeves rolled up and blood staining his apron. "Blackwood, thank God," Sullivan wiped his brow with a forearm. "I wasn't sure if the boy would find you." "What happened, Pat?" Jackson asked, setting his saddlebags on a nearby chair. Sullivan's expression darkened. "She won't say. Rode into town on a half-dead horse about an hour ago. Collapsed right outside. Been beaten severely, and her back." The doctor shook his head. "I've cleaned the wounds as best I can, but some are deep. Infection's already setting in. I remembered you mentioning those Indian remedies of yours." Jackson nodded grimly. "Let me see her." Sullivan led him into the back room, where a single oil lamp cast a soft glow over a narrow bed. On it lay a woman, face down, her back a tapestry of angry red welts and deep lacerations. The sheet covering her lower body was stained with blood. Jackson approached slowly, his experienced eye taking in the pattern of wounds. These weren't random injuries. Someone had taken their time, made it last. The thought made his jaw clench in barely suppressed rage. "Has she said anything?" Jackson asked, keeping his voice low as he set his leather case on a small table beside the bed. "Just her name, Elizabeth Hargrove. Said she came from somewhere near Helena, but nothing else. She's been drifting in and out of consciousness. The pain." Sullivan trailed off, gesturing helplessly. Jackson opened his case and began removing small glass bottles and packets of dried herbs. "I need hot water, as hot as you can get it, and clean cloths, plenty of them, and whiskey, the good stuff, not that rot gut from the saloon." While Sullivan gathered the requested items, Jackson studied the unconscious woman more carefully. Despite her injuries, he could see she was in her mid-30s, with hair the color of rich mahogany. Her hands, though small, showed calluses that spoke of hard work. She wasn't some pampered city woman who'd never known hardship. There was a story here, one Jackson suspected he wouldn't like. For the next 2 hours, Jackson and Sullivan worked side by side, cleaning wounds, applying poultices of crushed herbs mixed with honey, and binding the worst lacerations with bandages soaked in a tincture that Jackson brewed over Sullivan's small stove. The woman, Elizabeth, awoke several times, eyes wide with pain and fear, but Jackson spoke to her in low, soothing tones, until she slipped back into merciful unconsciousness. "These remedies of yours," Sullivan said as they finally stepped back, their work as complete as it could be for the moment. "Where did you learn them?" Jackson's gaze remained on Elizabeth's sleeping form. "Man named Two Bears, Cheyenne healer, found me half dead in a ravine after a skirmish with some Sioux raiders back in '69. By all rights, I should have died there, but he had different ideas." Sullivan nodded thoughtfully. "Well, I've seen enough medicine in my time to know when something works, conventional or not. If she survives the night, she might have a chance." "She'll survive," Jackson said with quiet certainty. "I've seen men with worse make it through with these treatments, but she'll need watching. I'll stay." Sullivan looked as though he might protest, but then simply nodded. "There's coffee on the stove. I'll come back at first light to check on her." After the doctor left, Jackson settled into a chair beside Elizabeth's bed. In the soft lamplight, he could see the faint pattern of older scars beneath the new wounds. This wasn't the first time she'd been subjected to such treatment. The realization made his hand drift unconsciously to the knife at his belt, fingers tightening around the worn handle. Whoever had done this deserved to meet the business end of that blade, or better yet, the 6 rounds in his Colt. But vengeance would have to wait. For now, the woman needed to heal. As the night deepened, Jackson found himself talking softly to her, though he doubted she could hear him. He told her about his ranch, about the herd of cattle he was slowly building, about the mountains that surrounded the valley, and how they looked when the first snow of winter dusted their peaks. Simple things, peaceful things, far removed from whatever hell she had escaped. Dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky when Elizabeth's eyes fluttered open, clear and alert for the first time since she'd been brought in. She regarded Jackson silently for a long moment, wariness evident in her gaze. "Water," she finally whispered, her voice rough from disuse. Jackson held a cup to her lips, supporting her head gently as she drank. When she'd had her fill, he set the cup aside, but remained close, noting the way she assessed him, taking in his weathered appearance and the visible scar on his face. "You're not the doctor," she said, her voice slightly stronger now. "No, ma'am. Name's Jackson Blackwood. I have some experience with treating wounds like yours. Doc Sullivan asked for my help." Her eyes, a striking shade of green, narrowed slightly. "Why would a rancher know how to treat wounds like this?" Jackson's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. "Never said I was always a rancher. Wore a marshal's badge for near 20 years before settling here." Understanding dawned in her expression. "You've seen men flogged." "Yes, ma'am. During the war and after. Learned some ways to help the healing, prevent infection." He paused, then added, "If you're feeling up to it, could use your name again. You told the doc, but best to hear it from you now that you're awake." "Elizabeth," she confirmed. "Elizabeth Hargrove." She attempted to shift position and immediately winced, a small gasp of pain escaping her lips. "Best lie still," Jackson advised. "Those wounds need time." Elizabeth's gaze dropped, a shadow crossing her face. "How bad is it?" Jackson considered sugarcoating the truth, but decided against it. She deserved honesty. "Bad enough. Some will scar despite our best efforts." Something like despair flickered in her eyes. "More scars," she whispered, almost to herself. Then, with visible effort, she composed her features. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Blackwood. I won't impose on your kindness longer than necessary." Before Jackson could respond, the door opened as Dr. Sullivan returned, his face lighting with pleased surprise when he saw Elizabeth awake and lucid. The morning progressed in a flurry of medical examinations, fresh bandages, and careful doses of laudanum to manage the pain. Throughout it all, Elizabeth remained stoic, answering questions about her physical state, but deflecting any inquiries about how she'd received her injuries or where she'd come from. By midday, Sullivan had declared himself cautiously optimistic about her recovery, though he insisted she remain under observation for at least a week. Jackson, satisfied that she was in good hands, prepared to return to his ranch, promising to return the next day with more of the herbal preparations that seemed to be helping. As he was about to depart, Elizabeth called out to him, her voice stronger than it had been that morning. "Mr. Blackwood?" He turned back, hat in hand. "Ma'am, why did you help me? You don't know me. I could be anyone, running from anything." Jackson considered her for a moment, noting the tension in her body despite her injuries, the way her eyes continually darted to the door and windows, the habits of someone who expected danger at any moment. He recognized those habits all too well. "Doesn't matter who you're running from, ma'am. No one deserves what was done to you." He settled his hat on his head. "Rest now. We can talk more tomorrow if you've a mind to." The days that followed fell into a pattern. Jackson would tend his ranch in the mornings, then ride into town in the afternoons to check on Elizabeth and prepare fresh poultices for her wounds. The treatments were working. Infection had been kept at bay, and new skin was forming over the less severe lacerations. Elizabeth grew stronger each day, eventually able to sit up and by the end of the week take short walks around Sullivan's clinic. She remained guarded about her past, but in bits and pieces, a picture emerged. She'd been married to a wealthy cattle baron near Helena, a man named Victor Hargrove, known for his political connections and ruthless business practices. When Jackson inquired if it was her husband who had beaten her, Elizabeth's silence and the fear that momentarily darkened her eyes were answer enough. On the 10th day after her arrival in Promise Creek, Elizabeth was well enough to leave the clinic. The question of where she would go hung unspoken between her and Jackson as he helped her gather the few possessions she had. A small bundle of clothing that Sullivan's wife had donated, and a locket containing a miniature portrait of a young girl with Elizabeth's eyes and smile. "Your daughter?" Jackson asked, as Elizabeth carefully tucked the locket back into the pocket of her borrowed dress. "Yes," she said softly. "Catherine. She's 8 now. She's with my sister in St. Louis. I sent her there last year when—" Elizabeth's voice faltered. "When things got worse with your husband," Jackson finished for her. Elizabeth nodded, her hands smoothing nervously over the fabric of her dress. "Victor wasn't always like this. Or perhaps he was, and I simply didn't see it. When we first married, he could be charming, generous even, but there was always a darkness in him, a need to control everything and everyone around him. When I defied him, even in small ways—" She gestured vaguely toward her back. "And now you're running?" Jackson stated simply. "Yes. He'll look for me, though. Victor doesn't let go of what he considers his property easily." Fear tinged her words, but beneath it, Jackson detected a steely determination. This was not a woman who had fled on impulse. She had planned, waited for her opportunity, and seized it when it came. "You need somewhere safe to stay while you heal completely," Jackson said after a moment's consideration. "Somewhere out of town, where questions won't be asked if a stranger comes looking." Elizabeth met his gaze directly. "Are you offering your ranch, Mr. Blackwood?" "I am. Got a spare room that's not being used. It's not fancy, but it's clean and quiet. No one would think to look for you there." He paused, then added, "And I've got experience dealing with men who don't understand when they're not wanted." A ghost of a smile crossed Elizabeth's lips, the first Jackson had seen from her. "I believe you do, Marshal." "Not Marshal anymore," he corrected. "Just a rancher now." "Somehow I doubt that's entirely true," Elizabeth replied, surprising him with her perception. "But I accept your offer, Mr. Blackwood, with gratitude." Jackson's ranch house was indeed modest, a 2-bedroom structure built of sturdy logs, with a large stone fireplace dividing the main living area from the small kitchen. The spare bedroom was sparsely furnished, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small writing desk beneath a window that looked out over the eastern pasture where Jackson's cattle grazed. It wasn't much, but Elizabeth settled in with quiet appreciation, seeming to find comfort in the simplicity and isolation of the ranch. The first few days of this new arrangement were marked by a careful dance as they established boundaries and routines. Jackson was often out working the ranch from sunrise until late afternoon, leaving Elizabeth to rest and recover her strength. In the evenings, they would share simple meals, their conversations gradually extending beyond the practicalities of daily life to more personal territories. Jackson learned that Elizabeth had grown up in Boston, the daughter of a professor at Harvard. She had been educated and cultured, with dreams of becoming a writer, until a family financial crisis had forced her to accept Victor Hargrove's proposal. He had seemed a salvation at the time, wealthy, connected, and seemingly besotted with her. The reality of life with him had emerged slowly, like a venomous snake uncoiling from hiding. In turn, Elizabeth discovered that Jackson had been born in Tennessee, had fought for the Union despite his Southern roots, and had taken up the Marshal's badge after the war when he'd found himself unable to return to civilian life. He spoke little of his time enforcing the law, but the few stories he shared revealed a man with a profound sense of justice and an unwillingness to bend to political pressures or bribes, qualities that had ultimately led to his resignation and retreat to this remote Montana valley. As the weeks passed and summer gave way to early autumn, Elizabeth's physical recovery progressed remarkably. The angry red welts faded to pink, and many of the shallower cuts healed completely. The deeper lacerations, however, formed the scars that Jackson had warned her about. Pale, raised lines across her back, a permanent testimony to the cruelty she had endured. She became increasingly helpful around the ranch, insisting on earning her keep by cooking meals, tending the small vegetable garden, and even learning to care for the chickens that provided eggs and the occasional Sunday dinner. Her presence transformed the Spartan ranch house, introducing small touches that made it feel more like a home. Wildflowers in a jar on the table, curtains sewn from fabric purchased at the general store, the scent of fresh-baked bread wafting through rooms that had known only the simple, functional meals of a bachelor. It was on a crisp October evening, with the first frost of the season silvering the grass outside, that the moment came which would forever alter the course of their lives. Elizabeth had been reaching for a book on a high shelf, her arms extended overhead, when her shawl had slipped from her shoulders. The back of her dress, altered by her own hand to accommodate her healing wounds, gaped open slightly, revealing a glimpse of the scars beneath. She turned at the sound of Jackson entering the room and saw his gaze fix momentarily on her exposed back. With a swift, almost panicked movement, she snatched the shawl from the floor and wrapped it tightly around herself, her face flushing with embarrassment. "Don't look at my scars," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please." Jackson moved closer, his steps deliberate but unthreatening. "Elizabeth," he said, her name soft on his lips. It was the first time he had used it instead of the more formal Mrs. Hargrove. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, the shawl clutched to her chest like armor. "They're hideous, a constant reminder of what I was, what I allowed myself to become." Jackson stood before her now, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. Smell the scent of leather and pine that always seemed to cling to his clothing. With infinite gentleness, he lifted her chin with one weathered finger, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Those scars," he said, his voice low and intense, "are the most beautiful part of you." Confusion flickered across Elizabeth's features. "How can you say that? They're ugly, shameful." "They're proof," Jackson interrupted, his blue eyes holding hers with unwavering certainty. "Proof of your courage, your strength, your will to survive and protect your daughter. Every scar tells a story of a battle fought and won. There's no shame in that, only honor." Tears welled in Elizabeth's eyes, spilling over to trace silver paths down her cheeks. I was so afraid for so long, she whispered. Afraid to speak, afraid to act, afraid to run. What kind of courage is that? The hardest kind, Jackson replied. The kind that waits for the right moment, that endures until then. The kind that puts a child's safety above your own. His hand moved to cup her cheek, thumb gently brushing away a tear. That's the kind of courage most men will never know. Elizabeth stood frozen, caught between the urge to pull away and the desperate longing to lean into his touch. No man had ever looked at her the way Jackson was looking at her now, as if she were something precious, something to be treasured rather than possessed. You don't know what you're saying, she managed finally. If Victor finds me, if Victor Hargrove sets foot on my land, he'll regret it, Jackson stated, a cold edge entering his voice. But that's not what's really frightening you, is it? Elizabeth swallowed hard, knowing he had seen through her deflection. No, she admitted. What frightens me is this. She gestured vaguely between them. Feeling something again, trusting again. I'm not sure I remember how. Jackson's expression softened. I'm not asking you to remember all at once, just to allow for the possibility, day by day. He took a step back, giving her space. I'll stoke the fire. It's getting cold. As he moved away, Elizabeth felt a curious emptiness, as if something essential had been withdrawn. She watched him kneel before the fireplace, adding logs and stirring the embers until flames leapt up, casting the room in a warm golden glow. The practiced movements of his hands, the strength in his broad shoulders, the quiet confidence that emanated from him, all of it spoke to something she had believed lost forever, a sense of safety. Jackson, she said, testing the sound of his given name on her lips. He turned, eyebrow raised in question. Elizabeth let the shawl slip from her shoulders, a deliberate act of vulnerability. Thank you, she said simply, for seeing me as I am and not looking away. Something shifted in Jackson's gaze, a warmth kindling there that had nothing to do with the fire behind him. I think I've been seeing you since the moment you rode into town, Elizabeth, and I can't imagine ever wanting to look away. The days that followed were marked by a new awareness between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of possibilities neither was quite ready to name. They continued their daily routines, Jackson tending the ranch, Elizabeth the house. But small changes revealed the evolution of their relationship. Their hands might brush as they passed dishes at dinner, lingering a moment longer than necessary. Conversations stretched later into the evening, punctuated by comfortable silences that required no filling. Occasionally, Elizabeth would catch Jackson watching her with an expression that made her heart flutter in a way she had forgotten it could. November brought the first heavy snow, transforming the valley into a pristine white expanse that glittered beneath the winter sun. The cattle were moved to sheltered pastures nearer the ranch house, and Jackson spent long hours ensuring they had access to feed and unfrozen water. Elizabeth found herself watching for his return each evening with increasing anticipation, the ranch house feeling strangely empty without his presence. It was during one such snowfall, with flakes drifting lazily past the windows and a fire crackling in the hearth, that Elizabeth finally gathered the courage to show Jackson the full extent of her scars. They had been sitting side by side on a small sofa, reading by lamplight, when she set aside her book and rose to her feet. "I want you to see," she said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "All of it." Jackson looked up, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Elizabeth, you don't need to." "I do," she interrupted gently. For myself as much as for you." With trembling fingers, she unbuttoned the high collar of her dress, then turned her back to him. Slowly, methodically, she loosened the garment until it fell away from her shoulders, exposing her back from nape to waist. She heard Jackson's sharp intake of breath, felt his gaze on her skin like a physical touch. The scars were a map of suffering, thin white lines crisscrossing with newer, pinker marks, some still slightly raised. They told a story of systematic cruelty, of pain inflicted with deliberate precision. But they also told a story of healing, of a body that refused to surrender, that knit itself back together despite everything. She felt the sofa shift as Jackson rose, heard his footsteps approach. Then, with exquisite tenderness, she felt his fingertips trace the longest of the scars, a line that ran from her right shoulder nearly to her left hip. "This one," he said, his voice a low rumble. "When?" "2 years ago," Elizabeth replied, forcing herself to remain still beneath his touch. "I spoke to the governor at a dinner party. Victor thought I was being too familiar, too opinionated." Jackson's finger moved to another scar, this one thicker, more jagged. "And this? I tried to leave the first time. He caught me at the train station." There was a moment of silence. Then Jackson's hand flattened against her back, warm and solid, covering several scars at once as if he could somehow absorb their pain through his palm. "And the last ones? The ones that brought you here?" Elizabeth closed her eyes, the memory still vivid. "He discovered I'd been corresponding with my sister, making arrangements for Catherine. He'd been drinking. The foreman had to pull him off me." Her voice remained steady, but a tear slipped down her cheek. "That's when I knew I had to get away, no matter the cost. I took his fastest horse the next morning while he was meeting with investors in town." Jackson's hand moved to her shoulder, gently turning her to face him. His eyes, when they met hers, held not pity, but profound respect, tinged with a barely contained fury that was not, she knew instinctively, directed at her. "If I ever meet Victor Hargrove," he said quietly, "God help him." Elizabeth placed her hand over his, where it rested on her shoulder. "I didn't show you to inspire vengeance, Jackson. I showed you because—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because these scars are part of me now. And if you and I are to, if we might become more to each other," Jackson finished for her, understanding her unspoken question. With deliberate care, he took her hand and guided it to his face, to the long scar that ran from ear to mouth. "We all carry marks, Elizabeth. Some visible, some hidden. They don't diminish us. They simply show how far we've come." She traced the scar with gentle fingers, feeling the slightly puckered skin beneath her touch. "How did you get this one?" "Knife fight in Dodge," he said. "Man didn't appreciate being arrested for beating his wife half to death. Figured he'd do the same to me." A grim smile touched his lips. "He didn't succeed." "What happened to him?" Elizabeth asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Hung by the neck until dead, as the sentence goes. Judge wasn't inclined to mercy for a man who'd killed 2 previous wives." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "And the wife moved east, last I heard, remarried some years later. Good man by all accounts." Jackson's hand came up to cup her cheek. "There can be life after suffering, Elizabeth. I've seen it. I've lived it." She leaned into his touch, allowing herself to draw strength from his certainty. "I'm beginning to believe that might be true." With careful movements, Elizabeth drew her dress back up over her shoulders, but she didn't immediately refasten it. Instead, she stepped closer to Jackson, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body, smell the soap he'd used that morning. "I think," she said softly, "that I would like you to kiss me now, if you're of a mind to." For an answer, Jackson's arms encircled her, mindful of her healing back, drawing her gently against him. His lips found hers in a kiss that began tender, almost reverent, but deepened as Elizabeth responded, her arms twining around his neck. Years of loneliness and fear seemed to melt away in the warmth of that embrace, replaced by a cautious but growing hope for something she had long since ceased to believe possible, a future untainted by dread. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for some time now," he admitted, a smile in his voice. Elizabeth smiled in return, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I think perhaps I have too," she confessed, though I wasn't ready to admit it, even to myself. The peaceful moment was shattered by the distant sound of horses approaching, multiple riders, moving at speed despite the snow. Jackson's expression immediately shifted, the tenderness replaced by alert wariness, as he moved to the window, careful to stay to the side where he wouldn't be visible from outside. "3 riders," he reported, his voice taut, "coming fast up the main trail." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. "Victor?" "Can't tell yet." Jackson moved with swift efficiency to the gun cabinet near the door, extracting his Winchester rifle and checking that it was loaded. "But I don't get many visitors, especially not after dark in a snowfall." Fear clutched at Elizabeth's throat, threatening to strangle her newfound hope. Mechanically, she began refastening her dress, her fingers clumsy with dread. "If it is him, he won't come alone. He'll have brought men, hired guns." Jackson's face was grim as he strapped on his gun belt, checking the Colt in its holster. "Get your coat and boots," he instructed. "There's a root cellar behind the kitchen, entrance under the rug. If things go bad, you get in there and bar the door from the inside. There's a tunnel leads out to the old oak by the creek. Use it." Elizabeth shook her head fiercely. "I won't leave you to face him alone." "This isn't a discussion, Elizabeth." Jackson's voice was firm, but not unkind. "I've dealt with men like Victor Hargrove before, but I can't focus on that if I'm worried about your safety." Before she could protest further, the sound of horses entering the yard reached them. Jackson moved to the door, rifle in hand. "Stay back," he warned, then stepped out onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him. Elizabeth pressed her ear to the wood, straining to hear the exchange. The wind carried snatches of conversation. A man's voice, unfamiliar, asking for directions to Promise Creek. Jackson's reply, measured and unhurried, giving the information requested. Then another voice, this one sending ice through Elizabeth's veins, despite the muffled quality. Victor's voice, smooth as silk and twice as deadly. "Actually, Mr. Blackwood, we're looking for a woman, my wife. She was injured some weeks back, might have passed through these parts. Elizabeth Hargrove. Perhaps you've seen her?" Elizabeth couldn't rake out Jackson's response, but Victor's reply came clearly enough. "That's interesting, because we have reliable information that a woman matching her description has been staying with a rancher outside Promise Creek, a former marshal, I believe. Would that be you, Mr. Blackwood?" There was a pause, then the unmistakable sound of multiple guns being drawn. Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Without conscious thought, she moved to the gun cabinet, extracting a smaller revolver that Jackson had shown her how to use for protection against wolves or coyotes. It felt heavy and foreign in her hand, but she gripped it with grim determination as she crept toward the window. Through the frost-edged glass, she could see Jackson standing on the porch, his rifle held casually, but ready. 3 men sat on horseback in the yard, Victor in the center, his elegant coat and hat a stark contrast to the rugged Montana landscape. Flanking him were 2 men Elizabeth didn't recognize, both wearing the practical garb of hired guns, their hands hovering near their holstered weapons. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," Jackson was saying, his posture deceptively relaxed. "I live alone, haven't had any visitors in months, excepting Doc Sullivan when I took a fall from my horse back in September." Victor's smile was cold in the moonlight. "Come now, Marshal. We both know that's not true. Elizabeth is here. I can practically smell her French perfume." He gestured to one of his companions. "Jennings here had a most informative conversation with young Tommy Reynolds in town. The boy was quite clear about a woman staying at your ranch, a woman with injuries that required special treatment." Elizabeth saw Jackson's shoulders tense slightly, the only outward sign that he recognized the threat was escalating. "Tommy Reynolds has an overactive imagination," he replied evenly. "But even if what you say were true, what business would it be of yours where I offer hospitality?" "Elizabeth is my wife," Victor stated, a dangerous edge entering his voice. "My property, in the eyes of the law. Harboring her would constitute theft." "A woman isn't property," Jackson said, his own tone hardening. "Not even in Montana territory." Victor laughed, a sound devoid of humor. How charmingly naive for a former lawman. "Now, I've been patient, but my patience is wearing thin. Send Elizabeth out, and we'll be on our way. No harm will come to you." "And if I told you there's no Elizabeth here to send out?" Victor sighed theatrically. "Then I'm afraid we'll have to search the premises. And if we find you've been lying..." He let the threat hang unfinished in the frosty air. Elizabeth saw Jackson's hand shift almost imperceptibly on his rifle. She knew what was coming, had seen enough violence to recognize its imminent arrival. In that moment, a strange calm settled over her. She would not hide in the root cellar while Jackson risked his life for her. She would not run from Victor any longer. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Drawing a deep breath, Elizabeth stepped onto the porch. "There's no need for threats, Victor," she said, her voice steady despite the terror coiling in her stomach. "I'm here." Victor's eyes widened momentarily in surprise, then narrowed as he took in her appearance. The simple dress, the healthy color in her cheeks, the revolver held firmly in her hand. "Elizabeth," he purred, recovering quickly, "you've led me on quite a chase, my dear. It's time to come home now." "This is my home," Elizabeth replied, moving to stand beside Jackson. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Victor's facade of civility slipped, revealing the rage beneath. "You seem to be under some misapprehension about your choices. Either you come with me now, or I'll have Jennings and Davis here kill your protector, and then you'll come with me anyway. Somewhat worse for wear, perhaps, but that can't be helped." Elizabeth raised the revolver, pointing it directly at her husband's chest. "I've learned a few things since I left, Victor. How to shoot, for one." Victor laughed derisively. "You won't pull that trigger. You haven't the spine for it." "She might not," Jackson interjected, his own rifle now aimed squarely at Victor. "But I do, and unlike the lady, I rarely miss." Tension crackled in the air like static before a lightning strike. Elizabeth could see calculations running behind Victor's eyes as he assessed the situation. Even with 2 guns at his disposal, the odds weren't in his favor. Jackson's reputation as a marksman was likely known to him, and the steady way Elizabeth held her weapon suggested she was not bluffing. "This is absurd," Victor finally said, though his bravado had diminished noticeably. "She is my wife. The law—" "The law," Jackson interrupted, "also has opinions about men who whip women until they're half dead. I imagine the circuit judge might be interested in hearing about that, should you press the issue." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Victor's face. "You have no proof." "I have her testimony," Jackson countered, "and the doctor who treated her. And these." With his free hand, he extracted several folded sheets of paper from his coat pocket. "Affidavits from 3 former servants of yours, detailing your treatment of Elizabeth and your previous wife. Took some doing to track them down, but a marshal's badge opens doors, even after it's been turned in." Elizabeth stared at Jackson in shock. He had been investigating Victor all this time, gathering evidence, preparing for precisely this confrontation. The realization both stunned and moved her. While she had been healing, he had been ensuring her future freedom. Victor's face had gone pale, then flushed with fury. "You interfering bastard," he snarled, his hand dropping to his own holstered pistol. "I'll see you both in the ground before I let—" The crack of Jackson's rifle cut through the night air before Victor could finish his threat or draw his weapon. The bullet struck not Victor, but his hat, sending it flying from his head to land in the snow several feet away. The shot was a warning, a demonstration of skill that left no doubt about what would happen if Victor made any further aggressive moves. "Next one won't miss," Jackson stated calmly, already chambering another round. "Your choice, Hargrove. Right away now. Divorce papers will find you within the week. Try anything else? They'll be burying whatever's left of you come morning." The 2 hired guns exchanged nervous glances, their earlier confidence evaporating in the face of Jackson's deadly competence. They had signed on to intimidate a lone woman and possibly an aging rancher, not to face down a former marshal whose aim was clearly as sharp as ever. "Mr. Hargrove," one of them began hesitantly, "perhaps we should—" "Shut up," Victor snapped, his gaze locked on Elizabeth. The hatred in his eyes was palpable, but beneath it lurked something else. The dawning realization that he had lost. Not just this confrontation, but Elizabeth herself. She was no longer the cowed, submissive wife he had brutalized into obedience. The woman standing before him, revolver steady in her hand, was a stranger to him, and from his expression, a deeply unwelcome one. "This isn't over," Victor spat, though the threat rang hollow even to Elizabeth's ears. "Yes, Victor," she replied softly. "It is." For a long, tense moment, the tableau held. Victor and his men on horseback, Elizabeth and Jackson on the porch, weapons trained on each other in the silent snowfall. Then, with a curse, Victor wrenched his horse's head around and spurred it savagely, galloping away down the trail. After a moment's hesitation, his companions followed, disappearing into the swirling snow until only the diminishing sound of hoofbeats remained. Elizabeth stood frozen, unable to quite believe what had just transpired. The revolver suddenly felt impossibly heavy in her hand. She lowered it slowly, her entire body beginning to tremble as the fear and tension she had been suppressing crashed through her. Jackson was at her side in an instant, one arm encircling her waist to support her as he gently took the revolver with his free hand. "It's all right," he murmured. "He's gone. He won't be back." "How can you be sure?" Elizabeth whispered, turning to press her face against his chest, seeking the solid reassurance of his heartbeat beneath her cheek. Men like Hargrove are cowards at heart, Jackson replied, his voice a comforting rumble against her ear. Now that he knows you're no longer under his power, that there are consequences waiting if he tries to reclaim you, he'll find easier prey. He pulled back slightly to meet her gaze, and those affidavits are real. I've been working with the territorial prosecutor. Victor Hargrove has a choice: sign the divorce papers or face charges that could see him hang. He's not a fool. He'll choose the path that lets him save face and keep his fortune. Tears welled in Elizabeth's eyes, not of fear or sorrow this time, but of overwhelming relief and gratitude. You did all that for me, without even telling me? Jackson's weathered face softened with affection. I wanted you to heal without worrying about what came next, to find your strength again. And you did. Pride colored his words. You stood beside me just now, ready to face whatever came. That took more courage than most men will ever know. Elizabeth reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his scar as she had earlier, but now with a new sense of connection. They were alike, she realized, both scarred by life, both survivors who had refused to let their wounds define them. What happens now? She asked softly. Jackson's smile was gentle but certain. That depends on you. The divorce papers will come through eventually. You'll be free to go wherever you wish, St. Louis to be with your daughter. Back east to your family. Or, he hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. Or I could stay, Elizabeth finished for him. Here, with you. It's not much, Jackson said, gesturing to the modest ranch house behind them. Nothing like what you had before. And I'm not a young man. Elizabeth laughed softly, the sound surprising them both. What I had before was a gilded cage and a monster for a husband. What you're offering? She paused, choosing her words carefully. What you're offering is something I'd given up hope of finding. A home, safety, kindness. Her hand moved to his chest, resting over his heart. And perhaps in time, love. No perhaps about it, Jackson replied, his voice rough with emotion. I think I've been falling in love with you since the day you rode into Promise Creek, half dead but still fighting. The confession, so simply stated yet so profound, stole Elizabeth's breath. For a moment, she could only stare up at him, this scarred, honorable man who had saved her in more ways than one. Then, with a small sound that was half laugh, half sob, she stood on tiptoe and kissed him. Not the gentle, tentative kiss of earlier, but one filled with promise and possibility. When they finally broke apart, the snow was falling more heavily, dusting their shoulders and hair with crystalline flakes that glittered in the light spilling from the open door. Jackson looked down at Elizabeth with a tenderness that made her heart swell. We should go inside, he said, though he made no move to release her from his embrace. It's cold out here. Elizabeth shook her head slightly, a smile curving her lips. I don't feel cold at all. Nevertheless, they retreated into the warmth of the house, closing the door on the night and the ghosts that had followed them for so long. As Jackson built up the fire and Elizabeth prepared a pot of coffee, a companionable silence settled between them. Not the tense, fearful silence that had characterized her life with Victor, but one filled with mutual understanding and growing affection. Later, as they sat side by side before the crackling fire, Elizabeth leaned her head against Jackson's shoulder, feeling for perhaps the first time in her adult life completely at peace. I'll need to write to my sister, she said thoughtfully. About Catherine, about bringing her here. Jackson nodded, his arm tightening slightly around her shoulders. This place could use a child's laughter, and we can add on to the house, make it proper for a family. The word family hung in the air between them, rich with meaning and promise. Elizabeth turned to look up at Jackson, studying the strong lines of his profile, illuminated by the firelight. He had called her scars beautiful, had seen in her damaged body not weakness, but strength. And in doing so, he had helped her begin to see it too. "I think," she said quietly, "that Catherine would like you very much, and this valley, it's a good place for second chances." Jackson met her gaze, the love in his eyes unmistakable now. "Second chances," he agreed, his hand finding hers and entwining their fingers. "For both of us." Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing tracks and softening edges, covering the land in a clean, white blanket that promised renewal when spring returned. But inside, beside the fire, Elizabeth and Jackson had already found their renewal in each other. Two souls marked by life's cruelties, yet still capable of tenderness, still brave enough to reach for happiness despite the scars they carried. As Elizabeth drifted toward sleep, her head on Jackson's shoulder and his arm protectively around her, she thought that perhaps her scars truly were beautiful after all. Not for what they were, but for where they had led her, to this place, to this moment, to this man who saw beyond them, to the woman she had always been beneath the pain. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elizabeth Hargrove looked toward tomorrow, not with dread, but with hope. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments.